Welcome to Bound by Books podcast. I'm Marianne Marianne, and today I am joined by Sherri Hayes. How are you, Sherri?
I'm good. How are you today, Marianne?
I am pretty good. We are just cooking along today with discussions. We're going to be talking to you guys about pushing boundaries.
Boundaries.
Yeah, pushing
Yeah.
boundaries, and pushing boundaries. It could be anything. Pushing boundaries in
Mhm.
terms of genre, pushing boundaries in terms of what you where the line is in your writing as to what you will cross and what you won't cross,
Mhm.
in terms of action, in terms of spiciness, in terms of whether social norms and so forth. It could also be pushing boundaries of things that, limitations that you think you've put on yourself as well. Like,
Mhm.
oh, I don't think I could ever write something. Like I always said, I don't think I could ever write a steampunk because I just, the genre doesn't speak to me. But you know what? Maybe if I actually picked up a book and read one, I might say, "Oh yeah, I could write this." So pushing
Yeah,
boundaries is a
I
is
could
another.
see you writing steampunk.
Yeah,
I
I
could.
don't know about that because it's a lot of I don't know. It's like Westworld, type of a thing. And
Yeah, but it's kind of like a cross almost between sci-fi and Western, which is kind of that's how I've always thought about it because it's got all the gadgety stuff.
yeah, yeah,
And I could see you getting into that because I mean you really like the detailed history type things, and I
I
could see
do,
you
I do.
potentially diving into that if you got the right and just got the inspiration there. But pushing boundaries, yeah, it's so varied depending on what your things like. For example, perfect example of pushing boundaries for me in my writing was my Finding Anna series. When I wrote this series, I knew that it was, well, first of all, it falls into the BDSM umbrella. So for anybody who's listening who does not know what BDSM is, uh it's an acronym that stands for bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadomasochism. So it's a really big umbrella that kind of covers more of the taboo subjects. When I wrote my Finding Anna series, I pushed the boundaries by doing the opposite of what was expected in that genre, because the first book in that series has zero sex in it.
Hmm. Which
All
I
they do
found
is,
surprising.
I know, right? Which all it had was, all they did was kiss, as far as physical stuff. So it was very, but in that respect, in that genre, in that subgenre of romance, I was pushing a boundary because it did not fall into the norm of what was expected in that. It was also very dark in the sense that it dealt with human trafficking, but
Yeah.
at the same time it wasn't dark because the writing had a very hopeful feel to it. So in so many different aspects, it also dealt more with the mental aspects of dominance and submission than it did the kinky sex. And those were all things that were very outside of the norm for the subgenre of BDSM romance, and still is.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, pushing boundaries in your genre, it seems like it's something that would be, um, I guess, a little more defined, as to, in
mhm.
terms of in terms of where the boundaries are, where the taboos lie, and because it's the genre in itself kind of
Pushes
falls.
boundaries.
It pushes boundaries of social norms and what people expect, and in a situation like that. There are going to be people who have a hard time wrapping their head around it. I know I have been one of those people who are just like, yeah, I don't get any, I don't get the pleasure through pain. But I've written some of it, not like yours, but I've written
Mm-hmm.
situations where there was pleasure through pain, not to the extent of what that would qualify as BDSM, but it's, I guess it's a, it really depends on what your readership is and what they will embrace, really,
Mm-hmm.
what you think. And you sometimes it's taking a risk too, like what you did, when you did the opposite of what was expected. You took a risk,
I
and
did.
pushing boundaries in and of itself, is
Mm-hmm.
involves risk taking, because your readership
Yes.
expects a certain thing, and when you
Mm-hmm.
don't give it to them, it could just blow up in your face, and like, I think that also speaks to some of the things that we've talked to in the past about staying in your lane, and making sure that you the contract that you agree upon with your readers, that you're going to, under this pen name, you are going to write a specific type of book, and that they're going to expect these certain elements all the time, and then pushing boundaries with them, whether or not
Mm-hmm.
you can have your readership evolve and grow with you. That's another
Yeah.
way to try and push boundaries. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, for me, the boundaries, in my books, have to be where I allow the darkness. I mean, I changed my background to say, for those of you who are looking at in YouTube, it says Club Vampire, and even though it looks like I have horns, it's not. It's actually the vampire. This is the logo for the Club Vampire, which is the Red Veil Diaries in New York City. And my vampires and my vampire stories, and even to extent to my shifter stories, um, there's always a darkness, and it's how I allow that darkness to be manifested. And I remember the one of the books that I pushed boundaries with, early on in my career, was my book Blood Legacy, and a lot of my readers didn't really care for that book too much, simply because, not that they didn't like the writing. In fact, most of the reviews are just like they loved the writing, but it was the content. It
Mm-hmm.
was too triggering for them, and because I had a couple of scenes that were, um, dubious consent, and one situation
Mm-hmm.
where a vampire created another vampire, who happened to be, was a male vampire with a male victim, or a male that he just was enamored of and was obsessed with, and he converted him, he changed him into a vampire against his will, and the items that went, the events that ensued afterwards. In fact, one of the comments was, I didn't know vampire rape was a genre,
Mm-hmm.
but it was because of the darkness that I needed to be planted in my character's heart, as to
Right.
this was his villain origin story, so to speak. And
Mm-hmm.
even though he's trying to hold on to the shreds of his humanity, and not fall into the abyss of just becoming this unfeeling predator. He doesn't want to be that way, even though
Mm-hmm.
he was created that way. It's so This is where I push the boundaries, because not all vampires sparkle, not all vampires have a happy family, and a white wedding at the end. Some of them have to claw through the slog in order to be able to
Yeah.
become whole again, even within their own darkness.
But it's the
Not,
emotional journey. That's
yeah.
the thing. I think that's where pushing boundaries um really becomes a good thing in writing, and creative writing specifically, is because it does, by pushing boundaries, you're able to push those emotions.
Well, that's where I'm saying it. Whereas I may not have the same kind of path to be able to push the boundaries the way, the BDSM genre does, in terms of taking what is
Mm-hmm.
already considered a, out of the box social norm,
Mm-hmm.
maybe even taboo in certain instances, and pushing it to the limit there.
Mm-hmm.
Or, like you did, doing an about face and giving them a different kind of a story, where the darkness, or the antisocial norm was the emotion and what she went through. and that,
Yeah, I
you
was going to
know,
say that. Yeah, the big darkness or pushing the boundaries. I mean, I pushed the boundaries, but doing a little outside the box type thing with obviously starting a series, starting an erotic romance series with a book that uh, is zero sex in it. But the real boundary pushing as far as darkness goes for my Finding Anna series was actually dealing with her trauma. You don't see a whole lot of books that are not dubious consent books, like heavy dubious consent books that
hmm
deal, especially in the romance genre, that deal with someone who was a victim of human trafficking. Or if they're out there. I have not seen a whole heck of a lot of them. Usually, I've told people when describing my Finding Anna series that my series starts where most slave books end. Usually, like you have when you're talking about someone getting captured and held against their will and tortured and all of that and forced to be a sex slave in a story, it's a dubious consent story. And, the person's being held captive. There's kind of this Stockholm syndrome thing maybe going on.
mm,
But then typically at the end of the story, she escapes or
right.
she gets rescued or something, but she gets out of that situation. And mine is a complete opposite. I started the series with her being rescued from that situation. So but I still had to
Deal with the
show
fallout.
deal
Yeah.
with the fallout, and that pushed those boundaries as well. So yeah, there's so many different ways to push the boundaries
Yeah, and I
in a
think
book.
that's a very smart thing. It's like, you hear the crescendo at the end of a fairy tale, and the, Cinderella and Prince Charming get married,
Mm-hmm.
and they ride off into the sunset. But the next day, what you don't realize is that, Cinderella was kept as a domestic slave, and she's having a hard time being the one given the orders to her staff, and they find her in the kitchen, cleaning out the cleaning out the cinders, because it's
Mm-hmm.
something that she has always done and now is having a hard time adjusting to her new life. So that,
Have you ever seen the musical Into the Woods?
yes.
Yes, that's as soon as I thought, because that's exactly
Yeah.
that fits in exactly what we're talking about here. Because the musical Into the Woods, if for anyone who has never seen it, I mean, it did get remade into a movie here recently in the last 10 years. But for anyone who has not seen it or isn't familiar with it, basically the first half of the musical, and I'm talking actual musical because you know, I knew the musical first, not the movie. But the first half of the musical is what you normally know, what the fairy tale that most of us are familiar with. Cinderella gets the prince, and the baker and his wife get the baby, and Jack gets the beans and goes up the beanstalk and gets the treasure. It's what we're normally think. And then
Right.
the second act completely flips the script and goes into what happens
Yeah,
next.
what happens after the end, because it's
Right.
not the end, it's not. There's always something else that goes on. And I
Right.
think that's exactly what you and I are talking about here
Exactly.
is taking what is expected in a book or in a genre, and actually pushing the envelope on it to give
Mm-hmm.
your reader something that it doesn't have to be in your face type of a thing,
No.
but to actually flip the switch. And not
Mm-hmm.
all authors do it, and not all readers like that. I mean, I think
Right.
you have to be very calculating if you're going to push the boundaries, whether it's with sex scenes, whether it's with action, whether it's that good guys don't always finish first,
Right.
that sometimes things don't always end with a happily ever after, that there's that one of the biggest things that you and I probably could agree upon in terms of being told you don't do is you don't kill off a main character. You don't kill off
Mm.
a love interest. It's just it's not done. Readers don't want to know that happens in real life. You don't do that. But I have known some authors who have killed off a main character. And
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's some of that is genre specific. Um, like for instance, in what is acceptable in a How I Romance Ends is different from what's acceptable in a sci-fi or a fantasy.
Yeah.
It whereas you could get away with maybe killing a best friend or a parent or something like that in a romance, you are gonna tick off a whole lot of people if you kill off the hero or the heroine.
Yeah. Yeah. You are.
Because that's not what is expected. That's not the trope that is expected, the qualifications, as it were, for
Hmm.
something to be a romance. A romance dictates that it has to be that the couple has to end up together in either a happily ever after or
Or
a
happily
happily for
for
now.
now. Yeah.
Right.
But I mean,
But
I
there are
think
plenty
about,
of other genres that you can do that would, if you're going to kill off somebody, there's plenty of people who are willing to read it. It's just
yeah,
different genre.
absolutely. I mean, my biggest thought in my head right now is Game of Thrones. You know,
Mm.
everybody was killed off in that book. I remember when I first started
Yeah.
watching the show, the first warning I got from one of my friends was, "Don't get too attached to anybody."
That's what I was
You know?
gonna say. That's one of the ones that I'm just like, I can be like, yeah, don't get too attached to anybody in that show
Yeah.
because you're as soon as you start getting attached to them, they're gonna die.
Yep. Yep. So, I
So
mean, pushing boundaries it's kind of I don't want to say a slippery slope, because it can be a treacherous path is probably better, because slippery slope, once you slip into it's a
mhm.
slope, so you just kind of snowball to the bottom and then you crash and burn.
It's
No,
got to
but
be calculated. I
yes,
think that's the word.
it could be a very
Yeah.
narrow and a little bit rocky path,
Hmm.
because you can stumble, you can
Hmm.
fall on a rocky path.
Right.
You have to be able to keep your balance on a narrow path that's rocky. So all of those analogies work, because it does have to be very calculated. You have to
Hmm.
decide whether or not pushing this boundary that you feel strongly about is enough of a impetus for you to do it, because you could lose readership. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying that pushing boundaries, you know, it can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. Like a perfect example
Hmm.
is having same-sex characters in your
Hmm.
books. All right. A lot of times it's not really mainstream to have a main character who is same sex oriented, but but for years romance books have had the quirky sidekick, who might have been the gay best
Right.
friend, or the gay hairdresser,
Right.
or the gay bartender, or what have you. But pushing the boundaries to actually have a main character who finds their love interest in a same-sex scenario could be pushing a boundary for you as a writer. The only thing that
Mhm.
I could suggest with something like that is, anytime you're going to push a boundary that has social norms, or or things that are outside of what personally, is that you need to have things sensitivity read, and you have to make sure that you're not just playing into stereotypes. You have to make sure that you're doing it not just for the sake of doing it because it's trend. That you have to actually, if this is what you want to do, go ahead and write it, but just make sure that you're doing it justice and you're doing it
I
correctly.
I think in that respect, in that specific scenario, it kind of depends on what the expectations you set up for your readership in general, because um, when there are complete subgenres that
Of
are
course there are.
dedicated
Absolutely.
to same-sex couples. And it's actually a fairly large genre and they have a dedicated readership. However, if you have spent 20 years writing 100 books with all male female romance romantic couples, and then you throw a same-sex couple in there, you may want to do a little research into what you're doing, because that is for you and your readership, that could be pushing a boundary, and most likely is pushing a boundary, because you have set up certain expectations to your readership, and now you're throwing them for a curveball. Now, for J.R. Ward, she did this in her Black Dagger Brotherhood series, and it did well, but she also did a great job of setting it up.
Well, this is what you have to do. You can't just pull a character out of thin air. It should be a character that
right.
your readership knows, your readership, you give them enough of a backstory, you give them enough of the character in other books leading up to it, so that when they do get their own story, it's seamless, just like J.R. Ward did, you know?
Right. But again, I think it goes back to, if you're going to push boundaries, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, there's a ton of authors that do it in various different ways, but you do need to go into it with your eyes open, with knowing what you're quote unquote getting yourself into,
or what you're risking.
Yeah, and what you're risking, and what your readership is willing to accept is not really the word I'm looking for, but it's the best one I can think.
Enjoy.
Because again, enjoy. Yeah. Because and it's not that what you're going to write is a bad thing, but again, a reader is picking up your specific books. Like, say you write small town romance. Your readership is picking up your books because you write small town romance, and that is what they like. If you suddenly decide to write a BDSM story that's set in the big city in, you know, a really dark club atmosphere, you know, with, you know, the extremes of, you know, of BDSM in there, with whips and chains and, you know, all,
dungeons,
you know,
and
dungeons and all this stuff, you are going to have you're gonna basically slap your it's the equivalent of slapping your reader across the face. You know, it's and you're gonna have a lot of readers that goes, what the heck is this?
Yeah. Well, this is where you can push a boundary, but you have to also understand that you have to push a boundary within certain limits of what you've already established. And that this is where it's saying, you
another
need
pen name.
Yeah, another pen name.
Create another pen name.
Create another pen name if you want to go there. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. And you might want to, you know, but sometimes pushing boundaries also has to be done in baby steps too. You know, you have to, if, you know, maybe almost like groom your readers to get used to this, you know, and some of them will fall off by the wayside because it's not what they want. And others might be like, okay, I enjoyed this. This is not too far fetched for me. This is not too out of the norm.
Is what, you know? J.R. Ward did, because she set up this book. She set up her book for, I mean, I think these characters, one or both of them was, it's been a while since I've read her series, but one or both of them was introduced like 3 or 4 books ahead of time.
Exactly.
I mean, so she was kind of building this romance, you know, this coupling for a long time over the course of several books.
Right.
So it was prepping her readers for that. And
also her books have a lot of darkness in them too. So the type of reader that she has would also be something that was the type of audience that would be a little more open to that kind of, that, you know, to to that kind of pushing of a boundary, as opposed to somebody who writes small, sweet, you know, small town.
You got to know
readership.
Your readers.
Yeah, you have to know your readers.
Knowing your readers, because again, your readers have certain expectations of what you're writing, and you kind of, I mean, it goes back to, you're making a contract with them. It's an implied contract.
Absolutely.
Sure, but you are making a contract with them, and they expect certain things. And when you veer off of that there's one thing of like taking a little side road, that's one thing. But when you completely deviate from the path that you have set as a writer, what you have set up, the expectations that you have set up with your readers, you need to be prepared for what is going to the feedback that you're going to get, and it's most likely going to mean you changing your marketing tactics, because there are people, because I'm sure there were quite a few people who read all of J.R. Ward's other books in her series and decided to skip that book. I'm sure there was, because it was not their cup of tea. They did not, there wasn't something they were interested in reading. And so therefore they just skipped it.
I mean,
Now,
she's pushed quite a few boundaries,
oh
J.R. Ward,
yeah.
where she had the one couple who she killed off a main character. She killed off Jane, and she dies I think she's either shot while she's in her car or the car blows up or what have you. But she
Yeah.
brings her back as a ghost that because these are vampire type, the
Mm-hmm.
Brotherhood are kind of vampires, that she has an ability to be either corporeal or somewhat corporeal,
Mm-hmm.
and they have a BDSM relationship. They have their own little
Yeah.
flat where they go and they have their
Mm-hmm.
fun and whatnot. So I mean, she has pushed boundaries as an author, and when I look at my own work and I look at what J.R. Ward has done, and I think to myself, I could do that. I could do that because I have, my stories carry that same kind of darkness. My
Yeah,
stories,
you have, yeah,
it has
they kind of ride that line.
yeah,
Yeah.
they do. And I have actually had my writing compared to hers, as
Mm-hmm.
being like a kissing cousin type of in terms of style, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
where my characters are. So I can, I pushed the boundary myself when I wrote Club Vampire, which is the Red Veil Diaries, and because it has to do with the Vampire Club having a back room where there are things that happen in that back room that it's by invitation only, and you basically sign a waiver because you could enter the back room and not come out of the back room, that type of a thing. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they even have an area where there's an oubliette, where they just things, bodies get tossed and so forth, but mostly it's for blood play and sex play, and it's for it's on, they call it the back room because it's for the vampires, and they're
Right.
and they're either their mates or their partners or their donors who are willing. And when you enter, I mean, the first thing I always have every character that goes in there, that what they smell is they smell sex and blood. That's the first thing
Yeah.
that hits them in the face, is the smell of sex and blood. And some people it titillates, and some people it revolts, and it depends on whether they stay or they go. And
Yeah.
it's because I've
But
had
yeah,
a couple.
you have that. Yeah, you have that ability because of the world that you have created. So
Yep.
let's transition this a little bit and talk about, because writing dark things is, whether you want to, most of us want to admit it or not, it can be very emotionally draining. I know
Absolutely.
when I was writing uh Brianna's story, when I would go into her trauma and do her flashbacks and actually write about her getting raped and tortured, it was very, very draining. And so I needed what I would call a palate cleanser.
Yep.
And I think most of us do. Maybe there are a few that don't, but most of us, I think, do. For me, it was my contemporary romances. I would write a story, I would write a Finding Anna book, and then I would go and I would write one of my Daniels Brothers books, which was it's still steamy contemporary romance, but there was no BDSM in it. Everything was set in normal, average, everyday life. There's some small town romances in there, and things like that. But there was no BDSM, there was no major trauma, no, none of that kind of stuff. If it was touched on, it was just touched on lightly,
Mm-hmm.
without diving into the deep headspace that I got into. So what do you use for your palate cleanser?
It's funny because palette cleansers can be used in both directions. When I finished the eighth book, and which is of Blood and Magic, because in the Cursed by Blood series, because there's so much trauma. I mean, in that book, my character was turned during the First World War, so it's all
Mhm.
and he was turned right after the Battle of the Somme, which was, if anybody knows anything about World War I, the Battle of the Somme was one of the bloodiest battles out there. I mean, and they couldn't even rescue everybody and people who were killed while they were trying to climb over, barbed wire, in no man's land and so forth. So so I wrote in different worlds to be able to cleanse my brain palette from that kind of heavy backstory. Even though all of my books, as dark as they get, I interject humor and silly and snark into every single one of them, or else my readers would never exhale, so I have to give them a chance to exhale. So I do that in those books. But in terms of the creative process, because we're our podcasts are for authors and aspiring authors and so forth. So when you're in that dark headspace, sometimes it's hard to find the funny. Sometimes it's hard to kind of find that light part of your writing that could give your readers a chance to exhale. And so you have to do something for that. And some people read. I do that too. I read other books that are not part of that genre, that are lighter. Some people watch movies. The other thing that I do besides reading and other lighter books in a different genre is I write in different worlds. And one of them happens to be Robin Peterman's Magic and Mayhem universe. And it's because her stuff is light, it's funny. One of the ways that she explains it is that it's side splitting in terms of being, that you laugh out loud. So I try to do that, but at the same time, if your author brain is wired to go towards dark, it's going to find its way in there anyway. The what happens when you're writing a lighter story is you have to pump the brakes because it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the storyline. So that's how I cleanse my palette in that respect. But then after I've written a bunch of these lighter, fluffier books,
you're ready to go back to
I'm ready to go back to the heavy, because it's like I'm sitting here going, oh my God, this stuff is so fluffy. I want to write something that's a little more meaty, that's meatier. And
it has a lot. Yeah, because you can really, like, with the darker stuff and the stuff that's really pushing boundaries, you can just, I don't know, it can just get in there and just take hold of it and just run with it. Sometimes. Whereas with the lighter stuff, you almost have to tiptoe around it a little bit. I mean, case in point, when I write my BDSM stuff, because BDSM romance falls into the erotic romance category and it's dealing with taboo subjects that pretty much cover the gamut. I mean, BDSM can be as simple as,
spanky.
Well, yeah, spanking, or even just general power play, as far as like, I'm in charge and, you're gonna, if I tell you to lay down, you're gonna lay down, or turn over, you're gonna turn, that kind of thing. Or it could be, somebody getting chained to a ceiling with a spreader bar between their legs, getting whipped. I mean, it can be so many different things. It can be blood play, it can be knife play, it can be so many different things. So there's a lot of freedom in that I don't, and plus I can go as detailed as I want on the sex scenes, because again, it's erotic romance. So graphic is perfectly okay. Whereas when I write a contemporary romance, I don't really write erotic contemporary. I just write mainstream adult contemporary. So there's sex, but it's not graphic sex. It's on the page, but I have to be careful of the wording that I use to describe things. I can't use certain words that I can use in my erotic stuff. So while it's lighter and fluffier and things, I do in a lot of ways feel a bit more constrained in the in my contemporary stuff than I do in my BDSM erotic stuff.
Yeah, for me,
but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Well, for me, I don't know if it's so much. I mean, the spicy books the books that I have that have the spicier elements in it. I mean, some of the sex is graphic, not BDSM graphic, but adult graphic. And I have actually often thought that I needed to go back in and kind of temper that a little bit, tame it down a little bit. But I'm talking more in terms of emotions. These lighter, funnier books, they're they're great escapes. But for somebody whose brain works like mine, and if you're out there listening to us or watching us and your brain
Mhm.
works that way too, and you need to grab hold of some deeper, darker emotions and build from there,
Mhm.
you know, you need to you need to have a palate cleanser in the other direction as well, to be able to cleanse
Yeah.
your palate, but at the same time then cleanse your palate from the light fluffy, to get back to the deeper,
Mhm.
darker stuff, the heavier, more detailed books, that are thought provoking. Because
Right.
sometimes books, the lighter, fluffier ones, while they're fun reads and they do cleanse your palate, they're they're not they wouldn't be what I would refer to as books that make you think, or books that give you a book hangover after you've read them. I
Mhm.
love books that give you a book hangover after you've read them. Books that linger for a couple of days after you've read the end, and you're like, they affect you, but they don't affect you in a bad way. So you're not turning off all
Mhm.
the lights and putting the covers over your head. I mean, I'm talking about that. The thoughts about the book, they linger in your head during your everyday life, and
Right.
then when you meet somebody who's read that book and had the same reaction, you're like, oh my God, I know. And it's something where and then where I think is why book clubs are fabulous, because then you get to discuss that. you know Whereas if
Right.
the lighter, fluffier stuff, the stories are good, but when you finish the book and you close it, it's like you forget about it immediately. So
Mm.
that's how, that for me, those are my palate cleansers.
Yeah, I do a lot of, like, I rarely read BDSM, which I know is probably shocking. But I mean, I do occasionally, but I think because I write a lot of it, I do tend to gravitate towards books that are more on the contemporary side, because I do need that downtime, especially right now where I have written two BDSM books back to back and I'm editing a third BDSM book. So I am stuck in the BDSM headspace right now. And so when I'm reading, the last thing I want to do right now is pick up a BDSM book, because I need that palate cleanser. I need to get out of that headspace, because I'm in it so much reading it. And not everybody's like that. There are some readers and authors who they read what they like to write, and they stay to that genre because it does, it's kind of almost like research for them,
Hmm.
which is fine, and you do need to do that to a certain extent. But I will say I write very realistic BDSM romances, and all of my BDSM stuff I send through a couple that's been living the lifestyle for over 20 years. So all my BDSM like elements,
See, sensitivity reader.
they pick that up.
Yeah.
They're looking at that kind of stuff, which I'll be honest, they don't catch a lot because I've been
No,
writing
I
it
mean
for so long.
but a sensitivity reader
So
is not an editor, and they're not a critique
no.
partner in that sense. A sensitivity reader is going to give you a black and white of whether or not you are doing their lifestyle disservice, or if you're giving it justice. And I think that's
Yeah.
something that's very, very important with any of the any when you push any boundary, is that you have to make sure that you're doing it justice. If it's not something that you are familiar with because it's your life, or it's something that you are personally acquainted with, or something you are living, that yourself, that you need to have somebody who's in it, in whatever way, shape, or form. If you're writing an interracial couple, yeah, find out what kind of obstacles that they've had to go through, what they so you're not just writing what television tells you, because television sometimes just gives you stereotypes
Oh,
you know
anybody, just speaking of television, BDSM television stuff is the absolute worst
See,
ever. I mean,
that's what I
seriously,
mean.
compared to a lot of the other stuff I see in there in fiction, I would say BDSM is probably the worst portrayed that I have ever seen in fiction, on
So I
television.
mean, this is this
So,
that speaks to what I'm talking about, is that there's what has been fictionalized and what has been given as a typical stereotype. And then there's the reality of it. And if you want to do your story justice, you will do your due diligence and you'll do your research properly, and you'll talk to the people who are in the know, so that you could, so that because you said it, Sherri, you write very realistic. Well, if you want your books to ring true and to do justice, and not have people come up and and be like, this is ridiculous, this isn't how this is.
But hold on, we have to talk about this, because since we're on this subject, just know, however, that even if you do your due diligence and get somebody to read it that has experience in that area, you are still going to get dissenters that are going to be like you, because you specifically are not. They are not going to care. They're going to have a problem. I have people that leave reviews that basically tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, that I'm not writing BDSM correctly, even though all of my books have been read, all my BDSM stuff has been read by people in the lifestyle. And I've actually gotten, not only from the couple that I have reading it, but I've gotten emails and messages from people who live the lifestyle and have for years, who thank me because my books are so realistic. But you're still going to get those people that think they know better, or think that the way you portrayed something is not the right way.
Well, I mean, you're always going to get detractors no matter what.
Just be aware of that. Yeah. Even if you do your due diligence, even if you try your best to do it right, to get it correct, you're never going to please 100% of everybody.
No, and that shouldn't be your aim. That shouldn't be your goal. Pleasing everybody. Your goal should be making sure that you're doing whatever boundary you're pushing justice. That you're not just doing it for the sake of doing it because it's trendy, or because it's it's something that you think is tittillating, that you do it the right way. So
words last for a long time.
Yeah,
I will just say that words last for a long time. I've said this before, your books will outlive you. Yep. So please try to approach your books and your subject matter with that in mind, because you want your books to stand the test of time. You don't want somebody reading your book 50 years from now and being, well, that would have never happened. That's not right. I mean, you want it to last. You want it to be
absolutely
a portrayal that is
correct.
I think so. All right. Well, I think we covered quite a lot of territory. We got down in a couple of rabbit holes there. But hopefully you have enjoyed our talk on pushing boundaries, some of the ways that we have pushed. Yeah.
And push them. Don't be afraid to push them. We're just telling you to, we're giving you a caveat, push your boundaries, but do it correctly with your eyes wide open.
Yes. Just be aware. Just go in, do your research, and do it, and have a way to, if you're going to push boundaries, especially if they are darker boundaries, have a palate cleanser, have Absolutely. A way to have some downtime and some breathers in between, so that you do not burn out. Because again, burning out as an author is horrible, because then your creative juices just kind of go.
They drive right up.
And you don't want that. That's not productive.
Got to feed that well.
Exactly. Well, hopefully you have enjoyed our discussion today, and we will be back next week with another topic in Bound by Books. See you next time.
Bye.
Wait! Before you go, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and check us out on our website, boundbybookspodcast.com.